Late in the afternoon on the quiet oak tree street. The sky was bathed in golden hues as the sun slowly set. Julia Anderson strolled leisurely along the long street, her soft footsteps brushing past meticulously decorated houses with blooming gardens. Her long blue dress swayed gently in the light breeze, and a light brown handbag dangled by her side with each step she took. Julia loved afternoons like this, where everything seemed to pause, and the world grew peaceful. She often spent late afternoons walking through this neighborhood, savoring the fresh air and the tranquility of life. The houses with lit windows, laughter echoing from behind high walls. All of it brought Julia a sense of familiarity and serenity. However, as she neared the corner where a small convenience store stood at the intersection, Julia noticed something unusual. From a distance, she saw a group of people gathered outside the store. It appeared that a conflict was unfolding. Julia frowned and quickened her pace to see what was happening. She saw a black teenager, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, cornered against the wall of the store. The boy had his hands raised, palms outward, clearly signaling fear and defensiveness. Standing in front of the boy was a police officer, his face stern and his voice booming over the sounds of passers-by. It was James Collins, a police officer Julia had seen a few times in the area. He always had a tense demeanor, and Julia had never seen him smile. The rigidity in his every movement made Julia uncomfortable. And now, watching him stand intimidatingly in front of the boy, she felt a deep unease. Julia paused briefly at the corner, her eyes locked on the situation ahead. The teenager looked terrified, his wide eyes pleading, his body pressed tightly against the cold brick wall. Behind the store's glass window, the elderly shopkeeper stood watching with a worried expression. But no one dared to intervene. Julia could sense the tension among the onlookers, and it was clear that no one wanted to be the first to step forward. Julia knew that most people her age would choose to look away and continue on their path. They would think this wasn't their business and that it was best to avoid getting involved. But for Julia, that was impossible. She had spent her life teaching, telling children to stand up against injustice and protect the vulnerable. She couldn't just stand there and watch without doing something. It was ingrained in her nature, and though her heart pounded with fear, Julia knew she had to do the right thing. Taking a deep breath, she started walking toward the scene. Her legs felt slightly shaky, but her resolve was firm. Julia moved closer to the conflict, and as she got within earshot, she could hear Officer James's sharp, threatening voice. "What are you doing here? I told you to leave, and you're still standing around? Looking for trouble?" James barked, his tone heavy with accusation. The teenager, Marcus, she guessed his name might be, stood there with his head lowered, unable to utter a word. Julia felt her heart tighten in her chest. She didn't know what the boy had done, but from the way he stood there, terrified and panicked, she couldn't believe he could have caused any serious trouble. Her grip on the strap of her handbag tightened, her palms damp with sweat. She didn't have a plan, nor did she know exactly what she would say. But what she knew, with absolute certainty, was that she couldn't just walk past and ignore this. "Excuse me, officer," Julia called out, her voice clear in the late afternoon air, catching the attention of a few passers-by who turned to look. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her, James, and Marcus. "Excuse me, officer," she repeated, keeping her tone calm, even though her heart pounded in her chest. James turned around, his cold eyes locking onto Julia. His expression was full of annoyance and anger. His hand lingered near his holstered gun, and Julia could see the tension in every move he made. Marcus glanced at her, his eyes filled with terror. Like a deer caught in headlights, he was breathing heavily, trying to remain calm but clearly overwhelmed by fear. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay out of this," James said, his voice low but laced with menace. The word ma'am held no respect, only a thinly veiled warning. His eyes bore into Julia's, daring her to say anything further. Julia felt her knees trembling beneath her long dress. But she didn't back down. She straightened her posture, her voice soft but firm. "Excuse me, officer, but I don't see any reason for you to treat this boy like this. He's just a child, and it doesn't look like he's done anything wrong." James frowned, his lips tightening, and he took another step toward her, his chest puffed out, a clear attempt to intimidate. "He was loitering outside the store, and I told him to leave. He refused, and now he's resisting. I'm doing my job, and this doesn't concern you." Julia glanced at Marcus, who shook his head slightly, his lips pressed together. His eyes cast downward as though he couldn't face what was happening. She looked back at James, her brow furrowed. "From what I can see, the boy isn't resisting at all," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety building inside her. "He just looks scared. Maybe if you talk to him instead of—" "That's enough," James snapped, cutting her off. His voice cracked like a thunderclap in the quiet afternoon, silencing the murmurs of the small crowd that had gathered. His hand finally moved away from his holstered gun, but he stepped closer to Julia, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job, all right? This boy is causing trouble, and I'm handling it." Julia stood her ground, even as her heart raced. She wasn't naive. She knew the situation was dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't simply walk away. Not when the boy in front of her looked like he was on the verge of tears or might bolt at any second. She kept her voice calm, trying to de-escalate the situation. "I'm not telling you how to do your job, officer. I just think maybe we could handle this a bit more gently. There's no need to scare him like this." James's eyes flashed with a dark intensity, a mix of anger and humiliation. His hand clenched tightly at his side, and Julia could feel the tension between them, like an invisible wall rising higher with every second. The veins on his neck stood out, his raw fury etched into every line of his face. He was losing control, and that frightened Julia more than she cared to admit. "What do you want me to say?" "Ha!" James growled, taking another step forward, his face now dangerously close to hers. "You don't know a damn thing about what's going on here, so back off, or I'll arrest you for interfering with a police officer. Is that what you want?" Julia swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to step back, to walk away and let the situation unfold without her. But her conscience wouldn't allow it. She had lived too many years, seen too much injustice in the world to be cowed by a man who thought his badge gave him the right to treat others unfairly. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locking firmly onto his. "I think," she said softly, her voice steady, "you're being unnecessarily aggressive. There's no need for this. You're better than this, officer." And that's when she saw it in James's eyes, the moment he snapped. Without any warning, James's arm swung, his fist connecting forcefully with Julia's cheek in a blow so powerful that time seemed to freeze in that moment. The impact sent Julia reeling backward, her head striking the edge of the curb with a sickening thud that made onlookers wince in horror. Julia felt her world spin as she tried to steady herself, her hands flailing to break her fall, but her legs tangled beneath her, and she collapsed hard onto the cold concrete. Her head struck the edge of the curb with brutal force, sending a searing pain radiating through her skull. Everything around her blurred as gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. Marcus was at her side in an instant, his face pale with shock. "Miss Julia," he cried, his voice trembling. He reached out his hands but hesitated, unsure of what to do, afraid that moving her might make things worse. Blood trickled from a gash on Julia's forehead, staining the silver strands of her hair crimson. Her eyes fluttered open weakly, trying to focus on her surroundings, but all she could see was a distorted haze. Officer James froze, his face draining of color as the gravity of his actions hit him. His eyes darted nervously around the scene, taking in the growing crowd, many of whom were now holding up their phones, recording every moment. Panic flashed across his features, but his voice remained defiant. "She attacked me," he yelled, as though repeating it enough times would make it true. She lost control, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Their horrified and disbelieving expressions told a different story. Murmurs began to ripple through the gathering, growing louder and angrier with every passing second. "He hit her," someone said, and others echoed the sentiment. Calls for justice filled the air. Someone had already dialed 911, and the wailing sirens of an approaching ambulance grew louder by the second. Julia's vision began to fade, and the sounds around her turned muffled and distant. She could hear Marcus calling her name again, his voice desperate and broken, but it sounded as though it came from a faraway place, happening to someone else. The last thing Julia saw before darkness enveloped her was the sky above, painted in the hues of a fading sunset. The sound of the ambulance siren grew louder, blending with the murmurs and shouts of the crowd gathered outside the convenience store. People still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. Some stood frozen, their phones still recording the scene before them, while others glanced anxiously at Julia, lying motionless on the sidewalk, with Marcus kneeling beside her. Marcus was still in shock. His hands trembled, his wide eyes fixed on Julia's pale face, streaked with blood trickling down from the wound on her forehead. "Miss Julia, are you okay?" he stammered, his voice shaking with panic. But Julia didn't respond. She lay there, eyes closed, her breathing shallow and weak. Marcus didn't know what to do. He could only kneel beside her, darting his gaze around, desperately seeking help. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited, his heart pounding fiercely in his chest. Terrified that she wouldn't wake up, a woman from the crowd stepped forward, kneeling down beside Marcus. Her voice was calm but filled with concern. "Young man, don't move her. She needs to stay in place until the ambulance arrives." Marcus nodded, his eyes still locked on Julia. He couldn't think of anything else except helping her, doing whatever it took to make sure she would be okay. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics quickly jumped out, rushing to unload the stretcher. 2 emergency responders, a young woman with her black hair tied back and a tall man, hurried over to Julia. The woman examined the wound on her forehead, her expression focused and professional. "She's sustained a serious head injury. We need to get her to the hospital immediately," she announced, her voice urgent in the tense air. Marcus was gently moved aside as the paramedics placed Julia onto the stretcher, secured an oxygen mask over her face, and carefully lifted her into the ambulance. He stood there, watching them with unrelenting worry in his eyes. His heart ached as he saw her being taken away, an overwhelming sense of helplessness settling over him. A different police officer approached Marcus, asking him a few brief questions about what had happened. Marcus answered mechanically, his mind still consumed by the haunting image of Julia's injury. All he wanted to know was if she would be okay, if she would pull through. As the ambulance pulled away, Marcus remained standing there, unsure of what to do next. The crowd gradually began to disperse, leaving the street to return to its cold, eerie quiet. Everything seemed to go back to normal. But for Marcus, nothing would ever be the same again. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Thomas Anderson, Julia's son, was seated in his office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. He was preparing documents for a corruption case he was handling, an investigation into misconduct within the police department. It was a complex case that demanded his full attention. But Thomas didn't feel tired. His unwavering pursuit of justice had always driven him, especially when dealing with a system rotting from the inside. The phone on Thomas's desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He raised an eyebrow as he glanced at the screen. The incoming call was from the hospital. A sudden wave of unease washed over him, causing his heart to beat faster. He quickly answered the call, his voice tinged with tension. "Hello, this is Thomas Anderson." "Mr. Anderson, this is Nurse Evans from the emergency room at St. Luke's Hospital." A calm yet clear voice replied, "Your mother, Julia Anderson, has been brought in following an accident. Her condition is very serious. The world seemed to tilt beneath Thomas. He blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. Wait, what happened? What kind of accident? What's wrong with my mother? Thomas's voice grew sharper, almost shouting. There was an assault, sir. The nurse said gently but cautiously. It would be best if you came here right away. We can provide more details when you arrive. Thomas froze for a moment, his mind racing to piece together what was happening. His mother attacked. Julia Anderson, a retired teacher known for her kindness and dedication to helping others. Someone who had never wronged anyone. Who could possibly harm her? A mix of anger and worry surged within him, but he forced himself to stay composed. I'll be there immediately, he said curtly before hanging up and grabbing the coat hanging on the back of his chair. He couldn't quite recall how he made it to the hospital. Everything was a blur, the images outside the car window flashing by without leaving an impression. One question dominated his mind. Is my mother okay? A silent fear tightened its grip on his chest. He fought to push it down, but it was no easy task. When Thomas arrived at the hospital, he practically burst through the main doors, rushing straight to the reception desk. The receptionist directed him to the emergency room, and he hurried down the corridor, his eyes scanning for any sign of his mother. Finally, he spotted a nurse standing near the emergency area, likely Nurse Evans, who had called him. She recognized him immediately by the panicked expression on his face. "Mr. Anderson?" she asked, her voice calm yet professional. "Yes, my mother. How is she?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking with worry. Nurse Evans gently gestured toward a room at the end of the hallway. "She's in critical condition. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her. But the head trauma she sustained is severe. She's under close observation right now." Thomas nodded stiffly, though his eyes were already focused beyond the nurse, searching for a glimpse of his mother. "Can I see her?" "She's being monitored closely at the moment, but you can go in briefly. Please keep quiet and avoid causing her any stress." Thomas entered the hospital room, and when he saw his mother, it felt as though someone had squeezed the air from his lungs. Julia lay on the hospital bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. Medical equipment beeped steadily around her, and her head was wrapped in thick bandages with visible bruises. She looked frail, so far removed from the strong, vibrant woman Thomas had always known. He stood by her bedside, silently gazing at her, unable to speak. A part of him wanted to break down, to scream out his pain and anger, but Thomas knew he couldn't afford to lose control. He had to stay composed, had to be strong, not just for his mother, but for himself as well. As Thomas stood by his mother's hospital bed, he heard the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He glanced down and saw Greg's name on the screen. Hesitating for a few seconds, he answered the call, stepping out of the room to avoid disturbing his mother. "Thomas, you need to hear this." Greg's voice came through immediately. "I'm not sure how to put this, but the person who attacked your mother, it's James Collins." Thomas froze, unable to react at first. James Collins. The name was familiar. Yes, he was the very police officer Thomas had been monitoring in the corruption case. Collins had been accused multiple times of excessive force, but there had never been enough evidence to convict him. Now, James had attacked his mother, the woman who had taught Thomas the true meaning of justice, of right and wrong. A cold fury rose within Thomas, sharpening his focus like never before. This wasn't just an attack on an innocent woman. This was an opportunity to expose the truth about those who abused their power. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, his voice low but resolute. "Positive," Greg confirmed. "Witnesses at the scene and videos taken by bystanders all confirm it." Thomas was silent for a moment, his mind working rapidly. The pieces of the corruption investigation he had been working on for months started falling into place. This could be the turning point, not just for him personally, but for an entire police system shrouded in the shadows of corruption and violence. "I'll handle this the right way," Thomas said firmly. Gather all the evidence, including the videos. I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning. Greg paused briefly, perhaps expecting Thomas to lash out in anger or demand revenge. But Thomas wasn't that kind of person. He knew he needed to keep a cool head and follow due process. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about justice. Are you sure you want to take this on yourself? Greg asked, his voice tinged with concern. Absolutely, Thomas replied, his tone even more resolute this time. We cannot compromise the law, no matter who the perpetrator is, even if it's someone close to us. Ending the call, Thomas returned to his mother's hospital room. He stood by her bed, gently holding her cold, frail hand. Despite her fragility, he could feel a quiet strength that inspired him. He knew he had to be strong, not just for her but for everyone who had ever suffered the same kind of injustice. Outside the window, the last rays of sunlight faded, giving way to darkness. But for Thomas, tonight marked the beginning of a new battle, a battle for justice and truth. The morning sun streamed through the window of Thomas's office, casting warm streaks of light over his cluttered desk. Papers, reports, and files were piled high, a testament to weeks of relentless investigation and unwavering pursuit of justice. Thomas sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the computer screen as he drafted the arrest warrant for James Collins. Greg knocked and entered with a serious expression, holding a thick folder in his hands. Marcus is here, Greg said, his voice steady. The boy seems nervous, but I think he's ready to cooperate. Thomas nodded, rising from his chair. Bring him into the conference room. I need to hear the full story from him. What Marcus knows might be the key to holding James Collins accountable. Greg led Marcus into the conference room. As the door opened, Marcus walked in hesitantly, his posture slightly hunched. His eyes showed clear signs of anxiety but also a flicker of determination. His gaze locked onto Thomas, a tall, composed man with a serious yet calm demeanor. Thomas offered a reassuring smile, trying to put Marcus at ease. Thank you for coming, Marcus, he said, motioning for the boy to take a seat. We need to hear exactly what happened that day. I know this isn't easy, but what you know is crucial. Marcus nodded, lowering himself into the chair across from Thomas. His hands trembled as he accepted a bottle of water from Greg. Taking a deep breath, Marcus steadied himself before speaking. I was just standing there, waiting for my friend. Marcus began, his voice low but clear. We were supposed to meet at the convenience store, and I was just waiting outside. But then that cop, he came up and started yelling at me, telling me to leave. Thomas observed Marcus carefully, watching the boy's gestures and expressions. Marcus continued, his voice tinged with both anger and fear as he recalled the events. I told him I was just waiting for my friend, but he didn't care. He kept threatening me, getting closer. And then Ms. Julia came. Marcus's voice faltered as the memory of Julia being attacked surfaced. His eyes reddened, and tears streamed down his face. She was only trying to help me. She didn't do anything wrong. I don't understand why he lost control like that. He punched her, and she fell. There was blood everywhere. Marcus paused, using his hand to wipe away his tears. Thomas remained silent, his unwavering gaze fixed on Marcus, fully absorbing the boy's pain. He nodded, his voice steady and comforting. You did the right thing, Marcus. You didn't run away. You stayed and helped. That was brave. And none of this is your fault. Marcus looked at Thomas, gratitude in his tearful eyes, but the fear lingered. Will she be okay? Mr. Anderson, Marcus asked, his voice trembling. Thomas hesitated for a moment, feeling a pang in his chest. He knew he had to be honest, no matter how difficult it was. The doctors are doing everything they can, he said, keeping his tone calm. My mother is very strong, and she won't give up easily. Marcus nodded, trying to suppress the overwhelming guilt pressing down on him. I managed to record the whole thing, he said, pulling a phone from his jacket pocket. I didn't think it would matter, but I started filming when he began yelling at me. I kept recording until Ms. Julia fell. Thomas took the phone from Marcus. His eyes focused on the video playing on the screen. Anger surged within him as he watched the footage of his mother being struck. But he forced himself to remain composed. You did well, Marcus. This video will help us bring the truth to light. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, James Collins was spiraling into a state of crisis. He sat in his small apartment, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from lack of sleep. His phone rang incessantly, but James had no desire to answer. He was fully aware of how dire the situation had become, being investigated by the prosecutor's office. And worse, for assaulting Thomas Anderson's mother, a respected and renowned prosecutor. This wasn't just a simple attack. It had the potential to obliterate his entire career. James pulled out his phone and dialed one of the few people he thought could help him. Patrick Hendrick, a representative for the police union. I'm in serious trouble, James said as soon as the call connected, his voice a mixture of panic and desperation. James, I know what's going on, Patrick replied, his tone low and tinged with irritation. Word's gotten around. Prosecutor Anderson is digging into everything. Not just what happened with Mrs. Anderson, but every case you've ever been involved in. He's turning over every stone. James clenched his teeth, a mix of anger and helplessness boiling within him. I can't go down alone for this, Patrick. I need the union's backing. We've buried worse cases than this before, and we can do it again. Patrick sighed, the stress evident in his voice. Look, the union is behind you, but you need to be careful. Stick to your self-defense story. Say she attacked you first. You had no choice but to protect yourself. That's the narrative. And you need to repeat it over and over without flinching. And listen, James, if Anderson really keeps pushing, things are going to get messy. You'll need people in the department to back you up. James nodded, his eyes staring blankly into space as anxiety and frustration pressed heavily on his chest. Patrick, make sure no one turns on me. We've covered for each other before. And now we need to keep it that way. The call ended, but James felt no relief. The overwhelming sense that everything was slipping out of his control left him unable to rest. Pacing back and forth in his cramped apartment, he struggled to devise a plan to escape the chaos closing in around him. He knew that the support of the union and his colleagues could only protect him up to a point. And now, Thomas Anderson, a man with power, persistence, and a personal stake, was coming after him with everything he had. Thomas sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen as Marcus's video replayed. The footage was crystal clear, capturing every detail from James Collins shouting at Marcus, to Julia stepping in, and finally, the moment the officer struck his mother. Julia had done nothing to threaten him, not a single gesture that could be deemed dangerous. She had simply stood there, courageous and resolute, but James had lost control. Greg entered the office, placing a new stack of documents on Thomas's desk. This video is strong enough for us to charge James, Greg said, his eyes locked on the screen replaying the moment James punched Julia. Thomas nodded, his gaze unwavering. It's not just evidence of his irrational actions. It's proof of his inability to control himself. This wasn't self-defense, it was an abuse of power. We need to bring him to justice. Greg gave a small, encouraging smile, though his expression remained tense. How far are you willing to take this? Greg asked cautiously. Thomas turned to Greg, his eyes filled with determination. As far as it takes. We need to hold James Collins accountable, not just for my mother, but for every person he's abused his power against, people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Greg nodded, his face serious. All right, then we'll see this through, but be careful. We both know the police union won't make this easy for you. Thomas smirked, a cold resolve in his demeanor. I never expected them to. The next day, the courtroom was packed with concerned citizens, members of the press, and representatives from the police union. Tension hung thick in the air as the trial of James Collins commenced. Marcus, the key witness, was called to the stand. He walked up with a mixture of nervousness and determination, his wide eyes fixed on James Collins, seated just a few steps away. Marcus took a deep breath before recounting the events of that fateful day. His voice trembled at first but gradually grew steadier and more confident as he detailed every moment. From waiting for his friend outside the store to James approaching and yelling at him. And finally, the moment when Julia stepped in to help and was attacked. James's defense attorney, John Monroe, a polished man with salt and pepper hair, approached to cross-examine Marcus. Monroe attempted to sow seeds of doubt, probing into Marcus's past and questioning whether he had a history of causing trouble. "Have you ever had issues with the police before, Marcus?" Monroe asked, his voice laced with skepticism, as if to suggest Marcus was a habitual troublemaker. Marcus hesitated, clearly unsettled by the question. He shook his head. "I know. I've been stopped a few times. But I didn't do anything wrong," he replied, striving to stay calm. Monroe took a step closer, his gaze sharp and probing. "So, is it merely a coincidence that Officer Collins, a seasoned police officer, found your behavior suspicious?" Thomas stood up, his voice firm and resonant. "Objection, Your Honor. The question is irrelevant to the incident." "Objection sustained," the judge replied, casting a stern look at Monroe. "Counsel, move on to another question." Monroe frowned, clearly frustrated, but he had no choice but to step back. Despite his attempts to undermine Marcus's credibility, the boy's testimony, combined with the undeniable video evidence, painted a clear picture of James Collins's abuse of power. Thomas glanced at Marcus and gave him a small, encouraging nod. Marcus had done exceptionally well. His testimony, coupled with the irrefutable evidence, helped construct a compelling narrative of what had truly transpired that day. A police officer losing control and abusing his authority to harm an innocent person. In the following days of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. The city's residents closely followed the proceedings, and the media covered every detail extensively. James Collins sat in the defendant's chair, his eyes vacant, though an unmistakable undercurrent of worry betrayed his composure. He knew that the tide was turning against him. Thomas Anderson, with calm determination, presented all the evidence at his disposal. Every detail of James's behavior, every witness's testimony was laid out clearly and methodically. This was not just about proving that his mother was a victim of police brutality, but also about exposing the true nature of James Collins, a man who abused his power and had been shielded by a corrupt system. Defense attorney John Monroe continued to defend James with every argument he could muster. He painted a picture of a dangerous situation, claiming that the officer had felt threatened by Marcus and Julia. But with every point Monroe raised, Thomas countered with concrete evidence and credible witness accounts. That day, Thomas called another witness to the stand, an elderly woman who owned the convenience store where the incident occurred. She stepped up hesitantly, her eyes betraying a mix of worry and determination. Her voice trembled, but her words were sincere as she recounted what she had seen that day. "The officer, he approached the boy and started yelling," she explained. "Then Ms. Julia came over, trying to calm things down. She only spoke. She didn't make any threatening moves. But then he hit her. I was terrified. We were all terrified." Monroe attempted to cross-examine her, but each answer she gave only further cemented the truth. James Collins had abused his power, and Julia had only been trying to help. When the store owner stepped down from the witness stand, Thomas could feel the shift in the room. The truth was becoming undeniable. No one in the courtroom could refute the evidence that Julia Anderson, an innocent woman, had been struck by a police officer who had lost control. Finally, it was James Collins' turn to testify in his own defense. He stepped up to the witness stand, attempting to project an air of calm and confidence. His lawyer, Monroe, had thoroughly coached him on how to answer questions to his advantage. But Thomas knew that nothing could alter the truth. James began speaking, his voice deliberately steady and composed, trying to convince the courtroom that his actions were taken in the interest of safety. "I didn't want things to escalate like they did," James said, his eyes scanning the courtroom before briefly resting on Thomas. The situation was tense. The teenager, Marcus, wasn't complying with my orders, and Ms. Julia approached quickly. I felt threatened and had to make a split-second decision. Thomas sat at the prosecution table, his eyes fixed on James, unwavering. He could see that James was attempting to twist the narrative to favor himself. But the evidence and testimonies told a very different story. When it was Thomas's turn for cross-examination, he approached the stand with a calm yet determined demeanor. Looking directly at James, he began, "Officer Collins, you're claiming you felt threatened by a 62-year-old unarmed woman standing several meters away." James pressed his lips together, trying to maintain his composure. "That's correct." She approached quickly, "and I didn't know what her intentions were." Thomas pressed on, his voice growing firmer. "The video evidence from the scene shows my mother standing still, making no threatening gestures. She did not come any closer than a safe distance. And it's clear you struck her without provocation. Can you explain this?" James' lips tightened, and the worry in his eyes became more evident. He hesitated, leaving the courtroom in a tense silence as everyone awaited his response. Thomas didn't push further, letting the silence linger, allowing the jury and the audience to draw their own conclusions that James Collins had no justification for his actions. Finally, James responded, his voice quieter now, stripped of its initial confidence. I felt threatened. It was a split-second decision. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But James' words failed to convince. Everything Thomas had presented, the video evidence, the testimonies from Marcus and eyewitnesses, painted a clear picture of a police officer who had lost control and abused his authority. As the trial continued, public pressure grew more intense. The media relentlessly covered the case, and articles about the incident circulated widely on social media. Images of Julia, her face bruised and head bandaged, had become a symbol of the fight against police brutality and abuse of power. Citizens gathered outside the courthouse, carrying banners and signs. They called for justice for Julia Anderson and demanded reforms within the police force. Chants of "Justice for Julia" echoed through the streets, loud enough for Thomas to hear from his office on the second floor of the courthouse. Greg walked in, his face etched with concern. "The pressure's mounting, Thomas," he said, his voice low. "The public is waiting for a fair outcome, but the police union, they're pushing back hard against us." Thomas turned to the window, watching the crowd gather below. They were counting on him, hoping he would deliver justice not just for his mother, but for everyone who had suffered abuse without a voice. He turned back to Greg, his eyes burning with determination. "I'm well aware, Greg, but I won't back down. We've come too far to stop now. This isn't just for my mother. It's for everyone who has faced violence and injustice without being able to defend themselves." Greg nodded, placing a thick file on the desk. "I figured you wouldn't. Here's the latest report on cases involving Collins. It looks like we have evidence not just from this attack, but a pattern of other violations he's committed, all covered up by people in power." Thomas opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages, the cases, the allegations of violence and abuse of authority, had all been buried under layers of administrative paperwork. He knew this was an opportunity to expose not only James Collins but also the system that had shielded him. Looking up from the file, Thomas's gaze was resolute. "We won't let anyone escape justice, Greg. No one is above the law." Finally, the day everyone had been waiting for arrived, the day the court would deliver its verdict. Inside the courtroom, everyone sat in silence, the tension so thick it was palpable. Julia, though still frail, had decided to attend the session. She sat in the front row, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression calm yet resolute. Thomas sat beside his mother, holding her hand, feeling both her fragility and her immense inner strength. James Collins stood at the defendant's stand, his face pale, his eyes downcast, as though he already knew what was coming. Lawyer Monroe sat next to him, trying to maintain a composed demeanor, but the worry in his eyes was evident. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose to their feet. When the judge sat down, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. He glanced through the documents on his desk before looking toward James Collins. After reviewing all the evidence, the witness testimonies, and hearing from both the defense and the prosecution, this court has reached a conclusion, the judge announced, his voice clear and authoritative. He turned his stern gaze toward James Collins. Officer James Collins has abused his authority and assaulted an innocent civilian without just cause. His actions not only violated the law but also eroded the public's trust in the police force. He is found guilty of intentional assault and will face the appropriate consequences. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then murmurs spread across the room. The citizens in attendance, those who had been waiting for this day, began to cheer and clap. Julia looked directly at James. Her eyes no longer filled with fear or anger, only peace. She knew justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. Thomas glanced at his mother, his eyes misting with emotion. He had fought with all he had, and now justice had been achieved for her. He turned his gaze to James Collins, who sat with his head bowed, his face ashen in defeat. Thomas knew many had doubted his resolve to pursue this case to the end. But he had done the right thing not just for his mother, but for all those who had suffered abuse and lacked a voice. He squeezed his mother's hand and whispered, "We did it, Mom. Justice has been served." Julia smiled, her eyes shining with pride and love. "You've always known how to do the right thing, Thomas. I'm so proud of you." The day after the verdict was delivered, Thomas and his mother returned home. They didn't say much, but both could feel the sense of relief quietly settling in the air. The long battle had reached a resolution, but Thomas knew that this was far from the end. What he had accomplished was only the first step in a long journey to reform the city's police system. Julia sat on the sofa, her hands trembling as she held the cup of tea Thomas had just made for her. He sat down beside her, gently placing his hand over hers. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both warmth and weariness. "You did it, Thomas," Julia whispered, her voice tender and full of emotion. "You didn't just do this for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly." Thomas looked at his mother, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it might be," he said, his voice warm. "I'm just trying to follow what you've always taught me." Julia shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've done so much more than that. I'm so proud of you, Thomas. I know you won't stop here." Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "That's right, Mom. I won't stop. This case was just the beginning. I need to continue investigating corruption. There's so much wrong in the system, and I'll do everything I can to change it." Julia gazed at her son, her pride unmistakable. She knew he was facing an immense challenge, but she also knew that Thomas was the kind of person who could rise to it. A few weeks after the trial, Thomas returned to his daily work at the prosecutor's office. However, his focus had shifted. Beyond handling routine cases, he was now deeply immersed in the ongoing investigation into corruption within the police department. Thomas had gathered a small team of trusted colleagues, individuals who shared his determination to expose those abusing their power. Greg, his reliable assistant, and Lisa, a young, passionate investigator, joined him in delving into reports, overlooked accusations, and cases that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. One late afternoon, Thomas, Greg, and Lisa sat in a conference room surrounded by bulletin boards covered in photos, documents, and red strings connecting various incidents. Thomas pointed at a cluster of familiar names, officers who had shielded James Collins over the years. "We need to start with these cases," Thomas said, his voice low but resolute. "Every one of these names is part of a system that protects those who abuse power. We need to uncover the links between them and those at the top." Lisa nodded as she flipped through a stack of documents. "We've found some critical information. It's not just a handful of officers. It looks like there's a large network, including high-ranking leaders in the department, involved in the cover-ups." Greg glanced at Thomas, concern evident in his eyes. "But this is going to be dangerous. Thomas, we're up against people with significant power, and they won't let us expose them easily. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Thomas met Greg's gaze, unwavering determination in his eyes. "Yes, Greg, we have to do this. If we don't act, who will stand up for the powerless? If we don't bring the truth to light, these abusers will continue to operate unchecked." Lisa placed her hand on the table, her voice firm with conviction. "I'm in, Thomas. No matter how hard it gets, I won't back down. We're fighting for justice." Thomas smiled, looking at his team. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but he wasn't alone. He had allies, people who were just as committed to justice as he was. Together, they were ready to take on the fight, no matter the cost. Months later, Thomas's investigation began to make significant progress. The documents and evidence he and his team gathered painted a clear picture of the system's corruption. Violent police officers were shielded, cases were buried, and innocent civilians had no voice within the legal system. Thomas and his team had accumulated enough evidence to file charges against several high-ranking officials within the police department. But before he could formally act, a call came from the police union. On the other end was Patrick Reynolds, the head of the union, sitting in his office, phone in hand. Thomas listened as Reynolds' cold, threatening voice echoed. "Thomas, I know what you're doing," Reynolds said. "You're trying to tear down this entire system. But let me be clear, you're playing with fire." Thomas raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the threat. "Patrick, I'm not tearing anything down. I'm seeking justice for the innocent and exposing those who abuse their power. If this system can't withstand the truth, that's its problem, not mine." There was a brief pause before Reynolds' tone became sharper. "You're making a mistake, Thomas. You're not just going up against a few people, you're taking on an entire system. If you keep this up, you'll lose everything: your job, your reputation, maybe even your life." Thomas smiled faintly, though his heart was heavy with the weight of tension. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Patrick, and I'm not afraid of losing anything if it means justice will prevail." The call ended, and Thomas knew he had stepped into a battle from which there was no turning back. But he also understood that he couldn't stand by and let injustice persist. Couldn't allow people like James Collins and those protecting him to continue unchecked. A week after the threatening call from Reynolds, Thomas received an anonymous letter. Inside were photos of him and his mother, accompanied by chilling threats that they would pay the price if Thomas continued his investigation. The images felt like daggers piercing Thomas's heart, but he refused to let fear control him. He walked into the meeting room where Lisa and Greg were waiting. On the table lay the investigation documents and the evidence they had collected. Thomas placed the letter on the table, his eyes burning with resolve. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we won't back down." Lisa looked at the letter, then lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, Thomas, but I'm not afraid. I'll keep going with you, no matter what they do." Greg nodded, his expression filled with solidarity and empathy. "You know, Thomas, the more they threaten us, the closer we must be to the truth. I'm not afraid of losing anything. We'll fight to the end." Thomas looked at his friends, his heart swelling with gratitude and resolve. He knew this wasn't just his fight. It was a battle for everyone who believed in justice and truth. Stepping over to the bulletin board on the wall, he pointed to the names and the covered-up cases pinned there. "We will press on. he said, his voice steady and powerful. "We will expose every single one of those who have abused their power. We won't let anyone escape the punishment they deserve." With that declaration, Thomas knew the road ahead would be long and treacherous. But he was no longer alone. He had his mother, his steadfast companions, and the support of the people standing behind him, rooting for justice and truth. Outside the window, sunlight streamed in, illuminating the bulletin board and the documents in the room. It was a light of hope, unwavering determination, and the justice that was steadily being served. Thomas Anderson knew the fight was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. With every step forward, he believed he was moving closer to a fairer city, one where no one stood above the law and justice was always upheld.